Good morning, my name is John Hnatio, and we're here to tell you a really interesting story about our justice system in the United States. This is a fascinating story, and I am the lead investigator on a case for several years now involving the Institute for Complexity Management. And I'm an investigator with the Program for Investigative Studies, which is a subcomponent of the Institute for Complexity Management. As you can see here, we're a nonprofit organization. We do work for people who are in trouble with unfair competition by the U.S. government and predatory conduct by both the U.S. government and large corporations involving small businesses across the United States. Today's story is about a company called Demodulation in New Jersey. And it is a fascinating story. It's perhaps the best example of what can happen to a system when things just aren't working right and you get the wrong people mixed in to create some very serious problems. I always start these things off, these talks like I give, with this little quote from a guy who's named Frederick Bastiat. Bastiat was roaming around over there in France in 1848. Seems like a long time ago, but the parallels between what Frederick Bastiat told us about the law and what's happening today are extremely significant. Now, what Bastiat basically told us is that when we have a situation that involves corruption, that the very system of justice we rely on to assure that everybody gets equal protection under the law breaks down, where the government itself becomes perverted, and the government itself then becomes a mechanism to further corruption. And I'll just give you a second here to read about our friend, Mr. Bastiat, and quite a remarkable intellect. By the way, he was not a lawyer. He was an economist and a philosopher who's just an observer of what we today call our legal system. Now let me tell you a little bit about this small company in New Jersey, a company called Demodulation Incorporated. Really small company that involves really only 3 people. And it's a material scientist, a gentleman named James O'Keefe, and his partner, Wesley King, and an electrical engineer named Mike Slavin. These guys all came together around a technology that I'll explain to you later, but it's a truly remarkable technology that does incredible things. And it also not only has commercial uses, but it also has highly classified government uses. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we go through the rest of the story today. And you can see these gentlemen, they're the best in the world at what they do. It's a eureka technology, just like I told you before, and you're going to be amazed at what I'm going to tell you right now about this technology. It's called microwire radio frequency technology, or what we call MWRF for short. And here you can see in this first little slide what it is. It's basically a small piece of wire, ferrite wire usually, but it can be other combinations of metals in the middle that's coated by glass. Now what's so fascinating is that little piece of stuff produces something thin as a hair. You can put this stuff in my coat pocket, you can put it on a battleship, you can put it on a tank, and it has the ability to monitor where that particular object is in geomagnetic space. So it has incredibly important applications, from jet fighter planes to aircraft carriers to submarines, you name it. Microwire is there. And the beauty of microwire is it's so small, you can barely see it. And if you can't see it, you don't know it's there. Thus, you see the intelligence uses of microwire as well as the uses for military purposes. Let's walk again through the uses of microwire and how it actually works. And it just takes a few minutes. It's really a lot simpler than it appears. It consists of the very small wire that I showed you before, which is very, very thin. And it's basically the glass with the metal core in it. And then you have a very unique capability with this wire. When you move the wire in geophysical space, you shake it around, it has a very unique interaction with the Earth's magnetic field. And in fact, without batteries, without anything else, it gives off a burst of energy. A truly remarkable thing. Can you imagine? You don't need any batteries to produce a pulse of energy. And that's all by motion, the way you move it, and the energy it gives off. It's very passive. You don't need batteries. Then, if you can get a signal, this burst of energy, and you can amplify the signal, then you can detect the signal by microwaves. It's that simple. And the most beautiful thing about this technology is that it works both at very near distances all the way to a satellite in space. Spread the area with microwire and then you detect your object. It's very, very simple technology, but you know the most valuable technologies are elegant. And this is what we call a very elegant technology. As I mentioned, lots and lots of uses for this technology. Everything from ships, and these are stealth, Navy vessels, airplane, jet fighters, our aircraft carriers, not only the carrier itself, but the airplanes. Now this microwire is really important here too for submarines. Because what we try to do with submarines is we try to find every technology we possibly can that prevents the enemy, say the Russians or the Chinese, whoever you perceive the enemy to be, from physically being able to see you when you're underwater. Now, one of the big things about a submarine is they're mostly made out of metal. And when they're made out of so much metal, they affect how you read the object as it moves through space. Very, very easy way to detect it. So what you use microwire to help do is to shield it. The same way you would create a stealth aircraft, you want to do similar things for submarine too. So you can see the breadth of military applications. Very, very wide breadth of applications. And it's not just airplanes, ships, tanks, guns, and stuff like that. In addition to all of these military applications that we've just talked about, there are some very, very important intelligence applications as well. The gentleman up in the far right-hand corner of the screen is somebody that you probably all recognize. His name is Edward Snowden. And Edward Snowden was the fellow who found that the National Security Agency, or the NSA, was gathering massive amounts of information on the American people. And he blew the whistle on the intelligence community of the United States for doing this rampant searching of information on telephone numbers, a variety of what we consider to be very personal, sensitive data. Now, among the things that Snowden released, and their top secret reports, or formerly top secret, they've been declassified, are a number of uses for intelligence type of technologies. The types of technologies, for example, that you can use on a computer cord. And if you use the technology on a computer cord, you can actually read every keystroke. You can read all of the data moving through the wire itself. I'm going to tell you now a story about how Alfred University, the Navy, and our folks from the Office of Naval Research and other folks in the Navy, and the state of New York through their economic development programs, came together in a certain way to basically take Demodulation's trade secrets. Now, the first step in understanding what happened is to understand how the grant process in New York is supposed to work versus the way that it really works. And in these two slides, I'm going to share with you kind of a view of how it's supposed to operate and then what really happens. In this case, we have three principal folks, and this was done under the Obama administration, so it isn't under this administration. We had President Obama, Hillary Clinton, who was running for president, who had a very, very close political relationship with Corning Glassworks, a very important thing to remember, and the economic development of upstate New York, because at this time, she was the senator from the great state of New York. And the third person in this game is the Congress, principally represented by Mr. Schumer. And Mr. Schumer and the guys, the Senator Schumer and the guys in the House, all get together and they lobby to get federal monies and other monies to put into this system. And the money comes in the system and it's allotted state by state depending on the power of the congressional oversight group. And it comes into New York State where it goes to Mr. Cuomo, who is the governor of the state of New York, who gathers all of this money around as part of the New York State budget and creates a massive grant program. We're talking programs that are over $1 billion a year, going out to try and create what we call economic development, do technology transfer from small businesses to large industry in order to create jobs and do a bunch of wonderful things for society. And the way it works in New York is like this. In New York, the money comes to Mr. Cuomo and it goes to a variety of quasi-governmental organizations, such as New York State, Empire State Development Corporation, NYSTAR Corporation, and most importantly to the State University of New York, SUNY, and their research fund. Now, remember that Alfred University is a member of the SUNY coalition in New York State. It's a state school. From here, the governor and the state legislature decide where the money is going to go. And they send it out here to other variety of folks who administer the grants. Some of the money goes around to different technology innovation centers, and they've established several of these throughout New York State. And this is where all of the big industry comes to work around a certain technology like microchip technology, potentially microwire, a whole variety of what they consider to be step technologies. These are the types of technologies that can have a tremendous impact in doing and creating jobs if they are commercialized. And the whole idea of these programs is to spur economic development in New York State, to take the places like Appalachia and give people wonderful jobs, high technology, high paying jobs. That's the name of the game. And a big way that they go, the money goes there, and then the other part of the money goes to the state universities. Over $1 billion a year, actually $900 million, goes every year to the State University of New York system, including Alfred University, and there are a whole bunch of these universities throughout New York State. Now, at the technology innovation centers, right, what happens is large business comes and they use the centers to augment the cost of research and development. So if they're producing a new product, for example, what they'll do is they'll work with one of these innovation centers and get part of the money here, and they try to attract small businesses to work with them. So imagine, if you will, that This is the Ceramic Corridor, which is the Technology Innovation Center for Corning in upstate New York. What they would do is bring in Corning Glassworks, right? And the demodulations would come in and feed in to the large business R&D base, and they would create a symbiotic relationship where there's something in it for both of them to move a technology forward to its next logical step. Finally, the end result of this is to produce those economic growth and the high-paying jobs. That's the ultimate objective of all of these things. Now, they tell us that's the way it works. Now, I'd like to share a slide with you based on our research in those notebooks and probably 5 years worth of just plain research about how it really works. And you've seen a lot of this. You've heard of the Buffalo Billions, you've heard of Caleros, lots of different fraud and corruption in these programs that's massive, and I mean massive. And we'll save that for a later segment as we go through this, but it's massive fraud. Okay, what's really happening looks like this. You have the money going to New York State, that's for sure, okay? But large business R&D, they're not putting very much into this process because the state's paying for it already, okay? And what happens is that there is all sorts of money and political favors, including major projects that the governor himself and other folks, special folks, the politicos, if you will, push from this area. So they don't go through any merit process, these projects. They're just selected for political reasons. In a sense, almost like payoffs. And what happens is you bypass all of what we call merit criteria for selecting only the best projects that are really going to work. Literally do the R&D for the company itself. And that becomes a subsidy now. They're not paying anything. And when small businesses come in, too often we see their intellectual property basically taken by large companies for pennies on the dollar, and they don't reap the benefits of their own entrepreneurship and hard work. No, it's the large corporations. And the end result is, and we have some statistics to show you, and they are shocking, and I mean literally shocking, and this is all talk until you look at true performance. So let's take a few minutes now and take a look at the performance of how this system works. Now that we've learned a little bit about how the system in New York State works, it's important to understand that the way the Navy worked into the economic development programs in New York State was critical, because what they did is they used that system to work with their partners, people like Corning Glassworks and people like Alfred University, in order to leverage their R&D value for military and intelligence purposes. So what they could do is they could literally have conversations with small businesses, and through a series of conversations, basically find out their trade secrets. And what the Navy wanted to do more than anything else in this case was to make absolutely certain that they knew what demodulation had done. How had they developed this technology? Now that we've seen a little bit about the way, at least in a general sense, the programs in New York State work, it's important to keep in mind as we go through the rest of the presentation that the Office of Naval Research in the U.S. Navy were actually embedded in that system. So it enabled the Navy to have very close communications with the small businesses who were developing new technologies, while at the same time dealing with the true scientists at Alfred University, a very, very valuable thing to have. This is what allows government organizations and the Navy to keep at the cutting edge of not only the technology that exists, but the innovations. And what the Navy did in the case of demodulation is they used this system in order to misappropriate demodulation's trade secrets. So they would let demodulation go out and develop their MWRF technology, do some great stuff, and then they would be baited in, meaning demodulation, into the system and say, hey, if we can work together, we may be able to come up with a project to help you cost share the money. In other words, if you want to make $1 million, $1 billion, it really doesn't matter, manufacturing facility, if you come work with us, you can use our facilities and all that sort of good stuff, and you'll get a fair share of whatever profits that come out of this thing. Unfortunately, that works on occasion, but most of the time it doesn't work out very well at all for the small businesses. They usually lose, for pennies on the dollar, technologies that could be worth billions of dollars. So it's a really, really cat and mouse game, and it's called technology transfer is the formal word for it. Now, one thing you need to understand about New York before we go forward, and the Navy, is that there's something called cost share. Okay, cost share means that the government gives you some money, industry throws in a little bit of money, and then small business comes along and tags along, and then everybody devotes a little bit, relatively speaking, to a project. And when you share money and you multiply a dollar that way, that is what we call cost sharing. But the important thing to understand in New York State, there's fraud going on. And I know there's fraud going on because if you look at my books over there, I have found instances where fraud has occurred. And I want to tell you one story, and it's about demodulation. I figured I would use a real story. Here we had a grant go through that process that I showed you, and the grant offer was for $2 million some odd dollars. It was a pretty sizable grant. And the government said, okay, you can have our $2 million if industry contributes a little bit and if demodulation contributes a little bit. And demodulation contributes a little bit. And so what happened was, Jim, when he was at Alfred University and dealing with the Navy, he was having lots and lots of conversations with the Navy. He was having a tremendous amount of communication with Alfred University and everyone there to try and bring his business together, but he wasn't getting any grants. And Jim said, golly gee whiz, why am I not getting any grants? And then we went in and started investigating. We began to look at what was going on in the program for investigative studies to see why was it that Jim wasn't getting any of this grant money. And what we found out is that the money was being taken away from him, stolen. Okay? For example, we found at the New York State Research and Development Fund, the guys that were doing this, that in order for these guys to get the $2 million, they lied. They lied. And they said that Demodulation had paid $500,000 in cost share for that $2 million. And it's not true. They didn't. And they said it was a cash contribution. Totally false. So what you're ending up with here, by NISTAR, is a shell game. Alfred University is still getting the money, but small business is being left out of the picture. A pretty rotten picture, especially for small businesses that are the cornerstone of the American economy. In New York State, it seems to be a bit of an oxymoron based on the research of the numbers that we did. We looked over a spectrum of years and we said, how much money is actually being spent? And then we asked the important question, is this process working? Are we obtaining more high-paying jobs, right, at a reasonable cost where people are getting long-term employment and at high-wage, good jobs? That's the bottom line. If you're spending money like you see spent over here on the right side of the screen, you should be getting something for your investment. It's called return on investment, or ROI. So when you look at federal grants, on average, right, in New York, $3 billion a year about. That's a lot of money. Of that 1.3 goes to Empire Development Corporation. That's a lot of money. And almost $1 billion of it goes to the State University of New York. So there isn't a problem with money, obviously. I mean, money is sure flowing, and a lot of it. The problem arises. Here are some sample projects that I took just out of my research on this thing. And these are, believe it or not, representative examples of what happens when that money gets sent out in the terms of real performance. And the bottom line is jobs, and high-paying jobs, and long-lasting jobs. You don't want to use these programs to create work for a person, for 15 days. And yet, that's what a lot of them do. And I'll show you some examples. $4.4 billion for 5,300 projects. No job creation, or very, very little job creation. And they don't even have targets. The state's largest incentive program provided more than $730 million for 270 television shows and movie productions. How long can a movie production keep you going? And yet the cost per job was $42,000 for a job that lasted maybe 3 months. The numbers somehow don't add up when you begin to look at performance. And then you look at local development. They gave out $1.3 billion, 660 projects, and the net number of jobs, 1,686. Do you know what the cost is? I mean, it's very easy to do that kind of math in your head. And the cost per job, you don't want to pay $70,000 just to create a job that lasts, a month, 2 months, or a year. You just don't. That's what we call fiscal mismanagement at its highest, is what we're seeing here. Within that corrupt environment of New York State, you've got the Navy, Alfred University, Demodulation, and others, all fighting for grants. Here's what happens that results in the loss of Demodulation's trade secrets, or these developments that they've made past the baseline of the technology that the government hasn't been able to make. That's the focus of the government's attention. What has this guy done that we haven't been able to do, and what can we misappropriate to support those classified programs and other programs? Now, we're still in Intel operation number 1. Demodulation goes up to Alfred University and they sign an agreement. They're intentionally, as I mentioned, cut out of those grant funds. And worse, put salt on a wound, even worse, they're leveraged without their knowledge to get more money for others. Not obviously a very fair proposition. ONR, Office of Naval Research, and other Navy elements misappropriate Demodulation's trade secrets. They're basically baited in. They say, hey, if we really like this stuff, maybe we can help you pay to commercialize the technology, so that in the end you can make the billions of dollars for all that commercial stuff, and we'll use this stuff on the side for our submarines, our aircraft, and for intelligence purposes. What do you think, Jim? But the government never came to Jim and asked that question. No, they stole and misappropriated his technology. And to add insult to injury, they take Jim's technology and they begin to write cover patents. Now, these are the technology developments that Jim already has, but they take them out of the patents and they write it without respect for, in patents, there's something called It's the intellectual property that's developed beforehand, that's out for everybody to use, and everybody can use it. It can be patented and not patented, but you have to get certain permissions to use it. That's what a patent's supposed to be all about. No, they skipped that step. They skipped it entirely and said, what the hell, we can just write another patent and nobody will know. Nobody will know. And then we can tell everybody that it's our patent and go make money with it. That's exactly what happened in the case of demodulation. Fascinating. Now, I'm going to tell you another indicator of what we consider to be very deeply embedded fraud in some of the programs that exist in New York State as a result of that type of situation that I just showed you. And this case is particularly troublesome to us. I found out about this case as a result of doing our investigation, in this case up at Alfred University. And it involved the death of a low to mid-level accountant, clerk, within Alfred University. Her name was Bobby Cornell. And Bobby Cornell was responsible for monitoring cash student transactions. And from what we were able to learn, first of all, we were shocked that anybody would be dealing with cash anymore, especially with students at a university. From an accounting standpoint, we were really shocked at that because that's never a good way to do business. But nonetheless, Bobby was responsible for overseeing these monies. And what happened is that she was called in and accused of embezzling money. And from our investigation of this matter, and I'll explain to you in a second, what we found is we certainly found no evidence whatsoever of embezzlement or the taking of money in Bobby Cornell's case as part of our investigation. We did a very extensive investigation, interviewed very many people with direct knowledge of the situation, and by golly, it was one story that just didn't add up. And here we go. Here's the official story. Here's what we were told by the people in charge. You know, accused of embezzlement, confronted by her boss with stealing. Boss says he found a second set. And by the way, I interviewed his boss, or her boss. So this is what I got from her boss. That she was keeping a second set of books about these cash transactions. Well, that's not surprising. How else are you going to do it if you don't have a computer accounting system to do it? Okay? Boss says, after she's confronted for stealing, that she took the computer cord off her desk and walked across campus with this computer cord. She went into a basement room in one of the administration buildings that's supposed to be normally locked. It's a utility room. And she supposedly hangs herself with this little cord on a pipe above ceiling height pipe. Pretty hard to do. Raises a lot of questions. Is it impossible? No. But it raised some very, very serious questions in our mind. And to be honest with you, our investigation shows this. Cash transactions at a modern university. That seems very, very odd. Program investigator, I was the lead investigator. I had past knowledge of fraud. And I knew about the $500,000. I had past knowledge, and I knew about the $500,000. So I automatically am beginning to think about things. Then reports of fixed computer accounting software. Okay, so this is what we were told, and this is what our investigation found. And we interviewed people that were directly involved or knowledgeable about the situation, all the way from people at the university right down to the local police department to find out, hey, what happened with this situation with Bobby Cornell? Well, the first thing that was very troublesome to us in looking at this is in a modern university, should you really be doing the type of cash transactions that they were doing at Alfred? And the answer is an absolute no. They shouldn't. I also had past knowledge of fraud, and I relied principally on that $500,000 NISTAR grant that showed there was fraud going on in this system, a cost share shell game. The next thing is we had one interview with a professor from Alfred University, a guy named Walter Schultz, who told us that Bobby Cornell had to back force these transactions that she was keeping in her ledger book into the computer system at the university, which means that it wasn't the most accurate reporting possible because she had to force fit in these hand transactions into a system that really wasn't compatible for her work. The family, when they found out that Bobby theoretically had committed suicide, started to ask some very, very tough questions because the university itself was giving them conflicting information about what had happened. Very conflicting. And there were reports by Professor Schultz that there was a note found, a suicide note. But no matter how far we hunted and looked, we couldn't find any note. Then nobody would show us a note. All they would do is say there was one. It would be very, very interesting and a good way to get to the bottom of this for an investigator to be able to see something that supposedly the person wrote as they committed such a, and I'll put it mildly, difficult type of suicide with a short cord going over the pipe. And last but not least, we talked with the police. There was a police investigation, and it was done by the Alfred Police Department. And when I went down to interview the chief of police in Alfred, he basically told me, I asked, did you go in and do this investigation from the standpoint of any possible foul play at all? And he said, no. No, all we did is go in and ask people to confirm that she, was dead and had a suicide. Well, as a former law enforcement official, I can tell you that's not the way those types of investigations are conducted. They are conducted going in with a completely blank mind. You don't know whether that person committed suicide or perhaps was murdered or a million different things in between. So what you have to do is keep an open mind, collect the data through a thorough investigation, and use that as your basis for determining what's called probable cause. Probable cause allows you to go the next step as a law enforcement officer to conduct a more thorough investigation. That was not done in the case of Bob. We did a very thorough investigation of the Cornell matter. However, our program for investigative studies, we aren't law enforcement officers, so we can't compel testimony or we can't, issue warrants, and we certainly can't arrest people. So the only way we get our information is from people who willingly share information with us, and then we take that information back, and what we do in our business is we don't just talk to one person, we talk to many people. And what we do is we compare their different testimony to find additional areas and then go back to the person and ask about those questions. That's what investigators do. And that's what we do, but we aren't a law enforcement group. So all we could do is show that there was probable cause for something happening and then take that to the government and the officials because they're the ones that really have to act on these types of reports. We can't do it. We're not a law enforcement agency. However, we did a very, very extensive report on demodulation that we did specifically and gave it to the FBI, which, by the way, contains all this information and much, much more. Probably 500 pages of documentation went to the FBI, the Department of Justice alone, concerning the death of Bobby Cornell and a whole variety of other indicators of massive public corruption involved in some of these programs in New York State. Basically, we were told, go away, we don't need you, okay? They were actually involved in attempting to prevent the widespread exposure of some of the information that we're presenting to you for the very first time as part of this documentary series. 5 major conclusions from our investigation of the Bobby Cornell matter, which are extremely, extremely significant. There's no doubt that Bobby's death, whether a homicide, a suicide, or whatever, was tied with fiscal mismanagement and occurred at a time when the university and others were under extreme budgetary pressure as the result of the September 11 attack on the Twin Towers in New York City by one Osama bin Laden. There was no full and complete investigation of this death. And I can tell you that absolutely based on discussions that I had with the Alfred Police Department, interviews that I personally conducted along with others of the key law enforcement players in this situation. Also based on the evidence, getting those interviews, going back, and writing a very comprehensive report, we concluded probable cause to believe that foul play could very well have been involved in the death of Bobby Cornell. Now, we don't have the law enforcement authority to go in and make arrests and compel testimony, sworn testimony, and all that sort of stuff. But from what even we found, we believe that something was not right in the death of Bobby Cornell. Significant contradictions in those testimony from the different people we talked to. One person saying, oh, there was a note, and another people saying, I never heard of any note. Golly gee whiz, you know, she left at 10. Oh no, she had a big meeting with the administrators at Alfred University before she died. She didn't walk across campus with a computer cord. Very, very fundamental and significant contradictions in the testimony that had a normal police investigation actually been conducted, would have immediately found. Immediately. And yet there was none of this in the Cornell matter. The testimony, in our mind, raises a lot of questions about what's really going on. And that's where we sit with Bobby Cornell as another example of the type of potential fraud that needs very, very, very close scrutiny and investigation by appropriate law enforcement officials. That's never occurred. That's never occurred.